We're going to get started. So, hello and welcome to everyone to A Fourth Sabbath, Jewish Christian Conversations in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Kara Gold. I'm a Jewish community member and leader based in downtown Toronto. As we gather here on Zoom tonight, most of us physically dwell in Toronto, dish with one spoon territory, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the land around the Great Lakes. Today, many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people call Toronto home. We recognize the diversity of the First Nations in this area and honor them as land stewards and community and culture keepers. We also recognize that many First Nations communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Gathering tonight to explore COVID-19 as a fourth Sabbath, many of us are people with faith identities or connected to faith communities who have the privilege of practicing our faith in myriad ways here on Turtle Island. We do so recognizing our status as guests and settlers on this land. Our ability to live our lives connected to our faith is a privilege in the face of a history of Indigenous oppression that attempted to strip First Nations of their connection to community, culture, and ability to pass on tradition through the generations. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be recording the session. The chat function will be public, so please feel free to add to the chat with comments and questions at any time, and note that private messages will be viewable by the host. In order to respect the speakers, everyone will be muted, and we hold this space with the aim of bringing diverse perspectives to the table. So we look forward to a productive and respectful conversation among this awesome temporary community space that we've created here all together. So I will now pass things along to Joshua.
Thank you for that introduction and framing, Kara. My name is Joshua Fernandez. I am the EDGE Innovation Team at the United Church of Canada's Community Manager. I have come to this conversation out of curiosity and interest in what Sabbath can bring to my own life, and I've had a lot of talks with friends about this, and it seems to be there seems to be appetite for it. So I'm glad to spend this evening with all of you here. I've asked two people I know and I'm in a relationship with to be panelists. Aaron Rotenberg is the Anik Shul spiritual leader. Him and I went on an interfaith solidarity trip last year. And his humility, as I name and claim this, maybe he'll speak differently. I experience him as an extremely authentic and humble spiritual leader, and perhaps because I experience him as being a real practitioner of Sabbath. He really listens to God, as I would say. I would like to ask your if this wording is right for you later, Aaron. Listens to God on that day. He spends a full Sabbath really listening, and my life is all about speaking, as I'm doing now. I need to kind of learn from this tradition and ritual, and I'm going to ask both of these speakers in a moment. Brian Clark, I sit on a board with at University of Toronto, and he is a historian of early Christian theology and has a lot of historical perspective to share with us. So before we frame out tonight's conversation and engage them from their wise traditions and experiences, I want to share something from Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann. And he's recently written something on quarantine fatigue or Sabbath rest. This is what he's written. Most of us are unthinkingly committed to a certain understanding of time that we might call Promethean. That is, we have come to regard time as something to fill, master, control, and plan with an aim of achievement, accomplishment, success, and perhaps money-making. That is not the same as making a living. When we live in Promethean time, it turns out that sheltering under house arrest is enormously frustrating. No doubt part of the urgency to reopen our public life is an urge to return to the demands and possibilities of Promethean time. In shelter, we find ourselves frustrated. because there is not much to accomplish within the limited sphere of our household, because there's not much to achieve in an environment that is non-competitive, perhaps except for an occasional board game. And there's not much to possess, which we already have within our reach, when we already have within our reach everything with no more territory to conquer. He says that the restraints imposed upon us by sheltering resist most of our Promethean agenda. We become restless, that is, unable to enter restorative rest. And then he contrasts that with covenantal time and says that at the center of covenantal time is Sabbath rest, towards which our entire week moves. We are noticing Sabbath rest all around us. The atmosphere is getting Sabbath from our overwhelming pollution. Our roads are getting Sabbath from the enormous number of accidents that have become routine. Covenantal time, he says, is marked by freedom from burden and the insatiable need to perform and produce so that we can center on being and not doing. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight and to learn. And I'm going to hand it to Aaron first to ask him, first, did I represent you correctly? And second is, what is Sabbath in the Jewish tradition? Where did it come from and what does it mean?
Thank you, Joshua. I felt well represented by the intro. And it does feel especially sweet to be able to talk about Sabbath in English and Shabbat in Hebrew with you, especially because it was special for me that we got to celebrate Shabbat together in the summer, as you mentioned, both in Grassy Narrows and going to shul together in Winnipeg. So it's sweet to talk about Shabbat here. And also because Shabbat or Sabbath, and I might use the English and Hebrew interchangeably, is really beloved to me. Right? There's lots of different aspects of Judaism, and probably Shabbat is one of my favorite parts. My current religious practice is, I would say, pretty observant. There's lots of ritual things that I do, but even earlier in my life, in my university days, when I wasn't so observant, I still loved to do Shabbat, to put on nice clothes. I wear a kippah all the time now, but I used to wear a kippah just on Shabbat, have good meals with friends. It's a really sweet part of my week, my whole life. But the question was about what is Shabbat and where does it come from? I brought some Shabbat props that I wanted to use to illustrate this a little bit. So Shabbat begins on Friday nights. You light candles perhaps in a candle holder like this. Think about the week that's passed, and then we say Kiddush. We sanctify the day over some grape juice or wine. This is my Kiddush cup. And the liturgy that we say over Kiddush, over the grape juice, mentions two sources for Shabbat. We say, and I'll sing this so you can get a little bit of a taste of the Kiddush liturgy. Zecher lema'aseh bereshit, which means in memory of the creation story. So we celebrate Shabbat to remember God resting at the end of 6 days of creation. We read in Genesis that God rested. But we also say, Zecher litziat mitzrayim, in memory of the Exodus from Egypt. There's also a significant and central aspect of Shabbat that we assert each week on Friday night. That's about liberation from slavery. And also part of Shabbat is about being free of, as we wrote in the little flyer descriptions, free of the taskmasters that are always trying to make us think about doing more work. Right? That sense of Promethean time that Joshua mentioned in the opening is always about acquiring and doing. Right? That's in Jewish understanding. That's what Egypt still is for us. That we still need to be free of that. And I think it's also something that we're thinking about in the Jewish calendar at this moment. We're just a couple of days away from Shavuot, or also known in English as the Festival of Pentecost, which is 50 days from Passover, where we commemorate the Exodus. We count 7 weeks until Shavuot, where we receive the revelation at Sinai, the laws, and we move from being slaves to Pharaoh, from this sense of slavery to really, I think, acquisition, material sort of world, to revelation at Sinai, which represents, in Jewish tradition, Torah, divine teaching, and connection with something more spiritual. And just to continue along the evolution of Shabbat, those are both biblical sources. The rabbis build on these roots, and they connect keeping Shabbat to building a tabernacle. All the 39 activities of building the tabernacle are not allowed on Shabbat. And the rabbis come up with a list of both things that we can't do, but there's also this sense of things that we must do, that are reflected in these two Jewish understandings of shamor, of guarding Shabbat, and zachor, remembering part of the essential aspect of Shabbat, which is, so we don't use electricity, I don't go in cars, I don't write on Shabbat, but there also is this positive element of making the day a little bit special, of having a meal that's a bit nicer, of cleaning the house. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is that it's also important in Jewish tradition and framing that Shabbat is the 7th day of the week. It's the last day of the week. Right? And this is framing that I have learned from Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who frames it that if Shabbat was the first day of the week, we would maybe relate to it as, I need to first have rest in order to work. And that's, again, I think that same Promethean sense that the rest is only needed to be able to accomplish and do more things. But that's not the Jewish approach. The approach is that I've worked, I've done what I need to this week so that I can actually rest and just be. To really rest in the sense of being and not in doing. It's really meant to be a taste of Olam Haba, this little glimpse of the world to come. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Joshua.
Thank you for preparing the props and the bilingual singing, Aaron. I know we're in for that treat. I'm going to ask the same question to you, Brian. What is the tradition in the Christian tradition? What is Sabbath? Where did it come from? What does it mean?
Well, thanks, Joshua. It means different things to different Christians, and I just want to start off with a bit of a personal reflection. I grew up in Montreal in the 1950s in an observant Roman Catholic household, and so I knew that Sunday was a day set apart from the rest of the week. So there are certain things that I was obliged to do, ought to do, and certain things that I shouldn't be doing on Sunday. But it was the Catholic understanding, which basically meant you need to go to church, attend Mass in the morning, family time around lunch, but then the rest of the day is pretty well yours, as long as you're doing something that is healthy, wholesome, and above all, not making a lot of noise. Remember, as a kid then, that was okay. So going out for a ride on your bike was all right. Trying to recreate the cop chase scene that you watched on TV the night before, probably not such a good idea because it was noisy. So fast forward to the late 1970s, I had lived in Vancouver. I lived in Chicago, and it was in May of 1978. I just arrived here in Toronto. I was unpacking boxes. It was a Sunday morning, and I just really bashed my thumb. It was a box of books, boom, bang. There was a split thumbnail, and I was bleeding like crazy. No bandages in the house. So I turned to my roommate and said, well, I guess I'm going to have to go to the pharmacy and see if I can find some bandages. And she told me, well, good luck with that. You'll have to find out which one is open. So welcome to Toronto the Good. And as you know, there's a whole history of that. Sabbatarian laws that basically regulated what could be open and could not be open in Ontario. And that goes back to actually a law that was passed in 1845 at the instance of the Presbyterian and Methodist churches at the time. And the legislation was called this, and the name is significant, an act to prevent the profanation of the Lord's Day. So basically this act was about what you couldn't do on a Sunday. No paid work, of course, no commerce, but essentially no play. All sports, swimming, fishing were barred. And for good measure, not that I thought there was a really big threat at the time, no Sunday papers. So no secular reading or buying secular literature is on. Now this conception of Sunday as a Sabbath actually goes back to the Protestant Reformation. And not all Protestants would agree with this. Some Protestants. When they read what they called the Old Testament, they thought there were certain things that ought to be, that all members of society should observe, and that the civil authorities ought to enforce that. So what they did is that they, in effect, appropriated the concept of Sabbath, and they did that in some very interesting ways. Sunday was to be a day of prayer and of worship. It was to be a day of godly conversation. By that, what they meant really was reading scripture, talking about it, thinking about the sermon. Heads of households, for example, were enjoined to take notes during the sermon, which would last at least an hour, if not longer, on a Sunday morning. And you could go back to church Sunday afternoon for more. So the day was basically meant to be one of prayer and of worship. The word recreation was not part of the Protestant vocabulary, nor was really rest. I mean, rest was something, yeah, it might, but you know, worshiping God is a strenuous thing. So rest was kind of suspicious, right? You weren't supposed to sleep in. You're supposed to, this is supposed to be an active day of contemplating God. But as I was saying, it's a day that ought not to be a day that we take as recreation. So for example, okay to walk to and from church, but don't think about going for a walk, because that's a secular engagement, not a religious one. And when I think about that, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I think the earliest Christians would have found this, maybe not the very earliest Christians, but many early Christians would have found this to be a very strange concept. When Christianity became primarily a Gentile movement, one of the first things they did was distinguish themselves from Judaism. And the way they did that was by changing the day that they met, the day that they observed. The day they met was Sunday, which they came to name the Lord's Day, right? The day that Jesus Christ resurrected. And originally, we think early Christians met on Sunday evenings, but pretty soon by mid-2nd century, maybe a bit later, the habit became to meet on Sunday morning, because that was the time of day that Christ resurrected from the grave. So early in the morning, just around sunrise, people would congregate, get together to celebrate the Eucharist. So you have formal ritual. And there are two aspects I think that are really critical to this ritual, to understand about this ritual. One of them was reconciliation, a kiss of peace between the members, right? Everyone in the assembly had to reconcile with one another and offer a kiss of peace as brothers and sisters. Second thing that they would do is that they would receive the consecrated bread. And this is really important to earliest Christians because even those who could not attend would have this consecrated bread brought to them. But the key thing here is that Sunday was an ordinary day of the week, it was a work day. They would have gone and observed the Eucharist. But one of the things but the three key things that they're trying to affirm with this is how we become a united faith, a community of faith. This is how we become united with our Savior. This is how we start the week. And now we go out into the world to love and serve the Lord. Over to you, Aaron.
I'm going to jump in with a little synthesis in between. Thank you so much, Brian. Just so everyone knows, that is not his, that's not a virtual background. He's a historian. All those are books that he's likely read. And now we're reaping the wisdom of his sharing. Thank you, Brian. Aaron, I'm going to pass it to you for this next question. It's a very strange time. Is this a Sabbath? And if so, who may or may not experience it as that? And I don't want you to get into, don't get too far, and just stick to that kind of that general framing, because we're going to go a little bit further with this afterwards. So is this a Sabbath, and who would or wouldn't experience it as such?
Yeah, so if this moment for you is feeling like this is rest, maybe even God-given rest, that's really asserting and affirming liberation and is allowing for other essential work that you need to do, then maybe this moment might be a Sabbath for you. But I feel like we had really fruitful conversations in the lead up to this webinar talk this evening, where I think really what we're speaking about, which I really value, is that that's probably not actually the case for most of us. That I feel like when I'm speaking with people, it's either that there's some folks like essential workers that are really experiencing like having to do extra work, and that there isn't even that element of rest. And there's others that feel stress and uncertainty and vulnerability around lack of work, and that also is not exactly rest. And I think especially in conversations that we were having about needing to look out for, Shabbat is a time when we're supposed to also be considering and looking out for the vulnerable in our society. Right? That the idea of being free of Egypt and free of these taskmasters of work and the weak should be for everybody. And that's not the case for many of us in the stresses and uncertainty that's connected with this time of being in COVID-19. Right, that Shabbat is supposed to be about pleasure and rest. We talk about the Hebrew words of oneg and menucha, but they're, right, it's not just only for me, it's supposed to be for us, for the larger circles that are around us. So I can say some more. Maybe I'll say a few more words and we can get into it a little bit deeper if there's other questions or follow-up. But I also feel like an essential aspect of Shabbat, of the Sabbath, is the wisdom of cycles, right? Of having a holiday that's not just once a year, that's also once a month. About valuing our cycles and time, right? The famous, or not the famous, the late Abraham Joshua Heschel, theologian and activist, talks about Shabbat as a temple in time. Really, right, that Judaism puts a lot of emphasis and value on really sanctifying our time. And the way that we do that is by noticing transition and noticing cycles. And it feels like our cycles and our way of relating to time is out of whack, is strange. So it doesn't feel like the wisdom of Shabbat is coming through in many ways in which we experience this lack of work or change in time that COVID is offering. Right, there is, in terms of, right, there's weekly cycles, there's daily cycles in Judaism, there's also yearly cycles. There's the Shemitah, or sabbatical year, which is meant to give rest to the earth, to be able to give rest to the plants, and also involves right, a different kind of release, and that this span of time feels like it's maybe more connected to Shemitah. But still, a lot of those pieces of rest and recuperation, I think, are not the essential pieces. So I think there's still questions about how is it a Sabbath? And right, that framing that we gave it of, is it a forced Sabbath? Feels like, can you have a forced Sabbath? Feels like they're hard to fit together. I'll leave my thoughts there for now.
Thank you, Aaron. And Brian, over to you on that same note. Is this a Sabbath in Christian theological terms? Would you consider that?
Well, yeah, I'd just like to echo a few things that Aaron was saying. Yeah, the days do seem to meld into one another. Cycle of the week seems hard to grasp these days. And, you know, Christians have always gathered regularly, and that's how we mark the week. Sunday is the first day of the week. But we also have, many of us have a liturgical cycle. And at this moment, that's still going on, but you know, it's happening virtually. We're not participating in it in the way that we've had before, with others in a certain place at a certain time. And the thing about the Eucharist, is that it creates its own time. It is its own time. You don't look at your watch, because watch, quite frankly, is irrelevant. Liturgy takes the time that it takes. But the other thing too, yeah, is that for so many people, this is the time of Sabbath. I mean,
we are connected.
Yeah, we are connected. But, you know, I'm thinking also that, you know, here in my neighborhood, 2 grocery stores have been closed recently. One of them is only partially reopened. And I think about the people who work in those stores, who have contracted COVID, whose members of their households may be at risk of contracting the disease. And I just think about the anxiety and the worry that they must experience. And so, yeah, I mean, people are still working and not sure that they can get to work safely, not sure that the conditions of work will keep them safe. And that's, I think, where connection comes in. I think there's more to be said about that. So over to you, Joshua.
Thank you. There's a lot in what both of you have shared, and we'll get to some of that shortly with some Q&A. So the last question, based on where you are right now and what you shared, how, like Aaron's puzzle pieces, forced and Sabbath, they don't seem to fit together, he said. How are you seeking Sabbath within this perhaps forced Sabbath or forced time, forced isolations, surely? Being forced to stay at home as it's a beautiful day outside. How are you seeking rest? How are you continuing to mark time? How are you using the wisdom of your tradition to inform a longer cycle? Perhaps I would say God's time. How do we, and maybe we can each gain or glean some wisdom from what you share about your personal experience in this time. I'll hand it to Aaron first and then to Brian.
Yeah, I do have this strange feeling, especially around Shabbat itself, right? Like Brian mentioned, also in Jewish community, it feels regular and obvious to be gathering on Shabbat. That an essential aspect of Sabbath for me is coming together with community. And also in my role as spiritual leader at the Annex Shul, of also being somebody who brings together and facilitates that coming together on Shabbat in particular. And not having that at first felt very strange. Right? And it's like, oh, if Shabbat is not going to shul, what is it? So there's been a process for me of trying to rethink, right, what the wisdom of Shabbat is. What is it offering me? And I do think that I've been able to tap into something that feels a little bit different. Instead of like getting up and going to shul, there's a certain kind of slowing down, and right, also like Brian mentioned, the days feel for sure like they're blending into each other. And yet there's still something different about my Shabbat practice. I still get up and say the liturgy, say some of the prayers on my own. But because nobody's really waiting for me, I'm also able to, I also have a mindfulness practice, so I do some meditation and sitting. I'm able to go through the words a little bit more slowly. And I think that, right, also taking time to slow down feels like connected to Shabbat for me. I wrote this note to myself. I'm on Facebook more often than I'd like, especially now these days. So there's a Chrome extension that I recommend. It's called the Facebook Feed Annihilator. So you can only get into Facebook to like see things that are important to you. The whole feed, it removes it and instead replaces it with an inspirational quote. So one of these quotes that I liked by Alan Watts is, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." And this is something that I think about in my meditation practice around letting things settle, and imagining water, muddy water, right? If you want it to be clear, you can't shake it up some more. You have to keep letting it settle. And I think that also, right, for me feels like part of the process of figuring out what Shabbat in COVID looks like. Even though it's been months, I'm still, I think, figuring it out, figuring out what it offers for me. A central piece of my Shabbat practice now, in distinction to what Brian was mentioning before, is to go on a walk for recreation. On Shabbat, I go for a long walk just for fun. But yeah, I feel like thoughts on what Shabbat is in this time is still being worked out in my mind.
Thanks, Aaron. Brian, over to you.
Yeah, well, yeah, Sundays is a great day to go for a walk. Maybe not in the park, but yeah, we all saw it happen at Trinity Bellwoods last weekend. Yeah, I guess one of the things that I've been doing, Zoom. Mike Parrish does a Zoom coffee hour. 30 to 40 people show up. Wonderful way to connect with people. The other thing I've been doing on Sundays is watching things on YouTube. One of the things I keep going back to is the sermon that the Archbishop of Canterbury offered on Easter Sunday. He celebrated the Eucharist with his wife in his kitchen. There were a few other people who participated remotely. But I keep going back to his sermon, and I keep also going back to some videos that were produced in my parish every week for the youth and children. They're short videos, 4 to 6 minutes apiece, but I keep going back to them, and I keep going back to Justin Welby's sermon. And I think why I keep going back to these videos and this sermon is they're short. There are not many words there, but much is being said, and that's something so there's much there to contemplate, and there are words that help me look at things in a different way, sort of shifting of the lens, so to speak. And I think the way that these videos work for me is that they are existential. They help me to see how I'm connected with God, to see how I'm connected with other human beings, to see how God, in fact, is among us, even now. And so, for me, one of the exciting things is to share these videos with my friends. Tell them what I've seen and heard, and ask them to check it out, and hear back what they think. So that's mainly what I've been doing on Sundays. Yeah, back to you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Aaron. There are a lot of wonderful people on this chat, and we're going to open it up for some questions. So you're able to raise your hand and we can call on you, or you can pop a question straight into the chat. And there's one that I can begin with by reading from Fredel Brief. And Brian or Aaron, whoever this question speaks to, feel free to just pick up right from this question. Fredel asks, do you think of COVID-19 as a, quote, negative gift from God? You can feel free to make some commentary thereafter if you'd like.
Or maybe can we ask Fredel to
clarify?
Share a word or two more about what you mean by the question?
Fredel, are you comfortable doing that? We can have you unmuted by our wonderful tech team.
Okay. I'm of the belief that everything we have is a gift from God. Sometimes we think of things as a positive gift from God. You have a new baby. This is wonderful, and you consider it a blessing from God. But everything in the world was created originally by God in my thinking. So when I look at COVID-19 that's having a devastating effect around the world, and the Spanish flu that had a more focused effect, but huge devastating effect, I have to ask myself, is there something I'm supposed to do that God expects of me? Am I supposed to take a look at the negativity out there? And is there something I'm supposed to offer? I'm just asking you. I'm not trying to. I don't know what the answer is. I'm struggling with it myself.
Thank you for that authentic sharing and struggling, Fidel. I think I'll speak for myself, but I know all people of faith and conscience are seeking and perhaps struggling with how to be in right relation with God and the world. So with that clarification, Brian or Aaron, if you could share any insight or wisdom that you have personally to offer Fidel and others.
I'm not sure if this is getting at exactly the same thing, but part of the negative aspect that I feel like is being brought to light or revealed is the deep inequity and inequality that exists in our society. That, right, Kara mentioned in the opening land statement, right, that Indigenous people are more negatively affected by COVID. There's many people that are already more vulnerable that face these consequences more harshly. So it feels like in seeing that negative aspect so on display, right, maybe the gift or the opportunities to try to change and reevaluate part of that. Right, that also part of Shabbat, there's part of Shabbat in the biblical telling imagines it as a leveled playing field, right, that everybody receives the same double portion of manna on Friday to extend over Shabbat. Everybody had the same, right, the same resources in that case. How can we shape our society in a way that allows us to make sure that everybody has equal access to the resources that they need? That's one thing that comes up for me.
Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, exactly. I mean, this pandemic really does highlight the vulnerabilities in our society. And I think what it also highlights is the responsibility that we have to those who are, to make sure that they aren't. I mean, this is it's also a structural issue, right? And so, to put it quite bluntly, you know, if people of faith, you know, if the answer to the question is, what did you learn from the COVID epidemic? And the answer is, well, we learned how to use Zoom. And that's the end of the answer. We are in deep, deep trouble because what are we doing this for, right? And I think that's really what this comes down to. I mean, I'm not a theologian, I'm a historian, so I don't like getting into deep metaphysical issues. But I think this really does bring things back to what our responsibility is for others. I mean, we are called to care for one another. I mean, that I believe that is one of the central things that Christ affirmed, right? Love one another. And that's not happening, and it needs to happen.
Aaron, I'm reminded of a piece of Jewish wisdom you hand wrote for me, I believe in Hebrew. I think you already know what it is. Would you like to share that? Because I think it might speak to definitely some of the challenges I felt pulled apart with my whole life, how to live in this world with what Brian mentioned, these unjust social structures that I'm embedded in and benefit from, while seeking liberation for all. And how do I know and how do I discern my part in that to add on to some of, to build off what Ferdell had mentioned? Are you aware of, can you recall what I'm speaking of?
Are you prompting me to see that I think there was a piece of rabbinic teaching from Pirkei Avot, from the Mishnah, that we discussed on our trip that says, Lo alecha ha-mlacha ligmor. You're not obligated to complete the entire task. That in this case, right, the issues in our society are deep and vast. But the second part of the teaching is Velo ata ben chorin lehipater mimena. That neither are you free to desist from trying to make significant change. Is that the one?
That is absolutely the one. Thank you. So you're implicated and you have responsibility, but not all of it. And when you, myself, Kara, and a few others on this call, Andrea and Peter, came back from that interfaith trip, I was very maladjusted. It was the first time I had been to a reserve in Canada, and I came back. It's much the same way I felt when I come back to a developing country after going to visit my ancestors and my family in India. And I just see within a few hours of flying or driving from a reserve to a city how disparate the quality of life is. And I was very maladjusted to coming back to Toronto and seeing the glitz and glamour and seeing how people within this country live. And my colleague Beth gave me this piece of paper, 15 rules for spiritual social justice. It was a Jesuit teaching, and two of them pop out to me right now. One is God, you are not. And that's like, you have God in you, but you are not responsible for the pain of the world, but you are responsible for doing your part. I can't remember the second part now, but there's a Christian spiritual tradition of contemplation and action, and listening to God and listening to the Spirit, and where I am meant to do. What am I meant to do? What is my calling with the gifts I have, with the body and intellect and the variety of social conditions that we all are different in our bodies. We have to do that discernment with ourselves. I see another question from Doug. Doug, would you like to ask it? I'm happy to read it out if you wouldn't mind.
So I'm not so much that I see it as a negative gift from God, but I see one of the gifts of COVID being the unveiling of some of the inequities, the marginalized, underpaid workers, the state of our long-term care, how particularly urban Indigenous people are being particularly hard hit, and some of the immigrant communities, the people that work in the meat packing plants in Alberta, for example. So are we going to learn from this unveiling? And what are we going to do about it, I think, is the real question. Are we going to actually, as a society, and I think this is where the religious communities can take the lead, are we going to do something about these things that have been unveiled for us in this time?
Thank you for that question, Doug. When you listed several of them, very attuned to our times, the meatpacking plants, underpaid workers, I remembered the second question, or the second piece of advice that stood with me of those 15. It was, pick an issue, doesn't matter which one, they're all connected. So for me, it feels like it's easy to get burdened with all of it. And we're all experiencing most of COVID from our homes, if we're blessed enough to have homes. We're seeing this on the news, on Twitter, on phone calls, but we're not actually seeing the meat plants because we're not going to them. We're not going to demonstrations or protests. Brian or Aaron, would you like to speak to Doug's comment and kind of question?
I feel like there are inspiring words to action, which I appreciate, Doug. Yes, especially yes to spiritual leaders and those who are involved in spiritual community to step up. I'm also grateful. I'm getting some private chats. It says from Marcy, but it also sounds like my social justice mentor in this front, Rabbi Shalom Schachter, who's reminded me that as I mentioned, we're approaching Shavuot. And when the children of Israel received the Torah on Shavuot, we're told that they said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we'll receive. But the first thing that they said was, Na'aseh, we're going to do it. And then we'll hear, then we'll think. But really the action is key. So I thank you, Rav Shalom, for reminding us of that.
Brian, did you want to add anything before we get on to our next question?
Just briefly, I don't see how anyone can remain indifferent after this. I mean, it's just not possible to go back to the way we did things. And I think that's the one thing about this pandemic, that it's unveiled for all to see, is what we have been talking about, are the inequalities, the injustices that exist. And each of us are called to do something about that in ways that we're able to do.
I like that, bite-sized. You know, it can seem like there's too much to chew on, but like in the ways that we're called. Thank you for that. Laura, and bump up before Laura, sorry, Andrea, would you like to give voice to your own question, or would you like me to read it?
Sure, yeah. I was just want to say first, like, thank you to the two of you for your words, and it's very inspiring. But the practical side of my brain is like, okay, where does one begin? So if you could each just point out a few ways of starting to incorporate Sabbath into our daily lives, especially for those who are not familiar with any Sabbath practice.
So, and I feel like maybe I've been talking about these two different ways of viewing Sabbath. Maybe one is a personal practice, and one is which hopefully is connected to an awareness practice that can maybe call us to action and notice at some of the unjust aspects of our society. So maybe I can make two suggestions on both those fronts. Like, one that I mentioned before is, right, there's an aspect of Shabbat that's about right, just taking pleasure in being with what is, right, of really, right, maybe spending one moment as set aside in your week to really just listen to what's going on internally, right? Like maybe set some time, right? Maybe make it a nice meal for yourself, and just rest and take pleasure in that. And hopefully that can be tied into a second part of feeling gratitude for that and wondering how to bring that sort of feeling of being okay and having sufficient food and shelter and resources. Like, how can I bring that same feeling to others that may not be experiencing that? Which is just maybe part of that action is also a question.
That's great framing, Aaron. Brian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a little. Yeah, I think, we live such busy lives, and I know I have a tendency to put things off that I know I should be doing, like self-care, contemplation. So one of the things I think I find helpful to do is actually just to put that at the top of the list, right? That's what you start to do at the beginning of the day. Whatever practice it is, choose something. It could be at the end of the day, but choose a particular time, choose a particular practice that sits well with you, and then just keep doing it and see what happens. Yeah.
Let's reflect something that Aaron shared with me in preparing for this panel. We're talking about things that give you life, and even now, Aaron was saying, if you're able to do things in this time, this liminal space of home quarantine that are life-giving, then maybe that is part of a Sabbath to you, but it may not be, because that may not be how many people are receiving it. So I like that. It's very personalized. Laura, would you like to give voice to your question?
I think she's trying, but it's not working.
There, that's what I think. We were playing back and forth. Sometimes I have to say yes and thank you. I just can't help with thinking about the earth and the Sabbath that we have given to the earth, and it makes me think about the concept of Jubilee. And I just wondered if you would care to speak to that. And then also, how do we take that concept, like even the forgiveness of debts, like how could that be a part of coming, like of a conversation that we bring into this inequity that we've seen? Or anyway, I just wondered if you had thoughts about this. It's something that's been sort of bubbling up in the last few weeks for me.
And that's a great question. I appreciate that, Joshua and Brian, that you've always let me answer first, but would you like to take this one? I also have some thoughts. Okay, maybe I'll go and then we'll keep in our pattern. Yeah, thank you for raising the question about Jubilee and remission of debts, Laura. I feel like actually the practice of Jubilee, which we have in our tradition, is sort of lost. And it feels like it functions as an aspirational piece. Like, oh, well, one day we might get back to being able to do Jubilee, where we can, and for those that aren't familiar, the framing, at least in the Torah, is that there's 7 years of these sabbatical cycles. And at the end of seven-year cycles, there's the 50th year, the Shnat HaYovel, the Jubilee year, where all land is returned to its original owners, and all debts are forgiven, all slaves are set free. And then it's a re-leveling of the playing field. And yeah, the question of how to get to that feels real. And then I feel like the biblical framing is pointing again to process, that we need to have year-long cycles of small sabbaticals that will cycle us up to doing that. And the sabbatical year also has, right, Shabbat has some of these pieces in it. And I feel like also the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, right, you're supposed to let your land rest. And those that are in need, right, are able to collect the excess produce. But there's also an element of redistribution that happens every 7 years. But how do we like keep doing small pieces that can enlarge it? And I know that you're asking, what can we be doing to do that? I'd say it's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer. One small thing that like jumps to mind is just recently I heard that Justin Trudeau was thinking of saying all workers should get 10 paid sick days, and it feels like just a small employment standards piece that's been lacking. That's the fight for 15 and fairness here in Ontario and across the country has been fighting for. So maybe that's one small thing that's recent that you can call up your MP and say, yes, that's something that we need.
Yeah, it's interesting. At the turn of the millennium, there were, it was an interfaith coalition, global interfaith coalition. It was pushing for Jubilee. And as we all know, it didn't happen. But yeah, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about, and worth thinking about what Jubilee is intended to achieve and why we can't seem to do it. We can't seem to do it country by country. We certainly can't seem to do it globally. But I think that gets to the heart of how our global economy and our local economy is structured, and who it benefits and who it doesn't benefit. And we need to talk about that, right? Because I mean, this is God's creation after all, and we ought to, all of us collectively ought to be accountable for how it's, what we do with God's creation.
Thank you, Brian and Aaron. I'm gonna open up one or two more questions. Is there anyone else who's got a question that'd like to ask? Comment, point of clarification? Pop your name in the chat. Kara is sharing some great resources in the chat as well.
I think I see Elliot's waving his hand.
Elliot would...
Easener.
I will...
Unmute.
There we go. We got you. Thank you, tech team.
Oh, am I unmuted? I guess I'm unmuted. First of all, I heard about this event, and I'm coming to you from the Oahu Beach in Hawaii. It's just been wonderful, and I'd like to encourage all of you, those who put it together, to do more of this kind of thing. I've always believed in interfaith activities, and we are all children of God. I'd like to pick up just briefly on a couple things that Aaron said that I think reflect his profound thinking, and of course, basically Jewish thinking. Talked about time to slow down and doing versus being. I know too many people who are doing. I have to do this, I have to do that, etc. And one wonders, what are you apart from all of that doing? And I think while technology that is wonderful today, it's enabled us to get together, unfortunately, it's created some interpersonal distance. So many people to say, send me an email. But what about the human voice? We can't hug or kiss each other now. Hopefully it'll happen before too long. But I think you spoke about social inequity, economic problems, etc. But let's bring it down to person A and person B, human A communicating with person B, and how technology, regrettably, has made it more difficult to handle. So I appreciate Aaron's comment about slowing down and thinking about doing versus being. And maybe for some people, they're doing is actually their being. That's kind of rhetorical. I'm not sure. Perhaps Aaron would like to pick up on that. Again, I commend all of you for a wonderful, wonderful event. And a few of my friends from the Hawaiian part of Cleveland here in Shaker Heights have signed on tonight.
Thanks for the question, Elliot. For me, part of being is being connected to our physical bodies and our physical sensations. And much of our, well, at least my experience of the culture that I'm living in, right, wants us to do in a way that's not always connected to what I'm physically feeling. And so for me, part of slowing down is slowing down to notice, right, the physical sensation of my body in this chair, physical sensation of breath entering and exiting, my lungs, my nose. And it's true that sometimes technology takes us away from that, right? That closeness of physical sensation. And I think that's one aspect of my Shabbat practice that I appreciate, if not engaging with technology, and brings me more into, right, the physical sensation of my world. And when we're not socially isolating, also in direct physical connection with people at Shabbat gatherings or just seeing friends and family. And it feels hard, right, at this moment when we have less access to that, and some of the main way to interact is often through technology, which doesn't have the same direct physical connection. Yeah, it feels like that's part of the loss that we're all experiencing in this moment. And I would say that also, to the extent that we can find practices and ways to also sit with and feel that loss, maybe will allow for, right, hoping improved and different connections when we make it through. I'll pause there. I know I make it hard for you because I speak slowly generally, and then I've paused at the end of what I have to say, and then Joshua's waiting up. Is that the end?
It's great. I experience you, Aaron, you and Brian both as maybe I would imagine deeply rooted in your own faiths, as a good balance of not getting caught up in the doing and being present. You mentioned mindfulness meditation practice. So before, friends, thank you for gathering with us today. Before, I'm going to put both of our speakers on the spot, and I'll give them a moment to think about it. My spiritual practice is greatly informed by a Quaker wise man, Parker Palmer, and his Center for Courage and Renewal. And part of their pedagogy is that the soul won't come out if there's a wild animal barking. And that wild animal often, to me, is the economy. People doing all kinds of things all the time. But listening for God within, in silence, in being, is very counterproductive to, not counterproductive, antithetical to everything that our world stands for. I think of Brian's comments about no reading secular news on Sundays, and I think of how excited I am for the Sunday Times that's that thick. It takes me a week to get through, but that's the day it comes out. And you know, it's we're living in different times, and even Bergman talks about it being all kinds of. I don't want to waste time finding this, but we're living in a new kind of largely unreligious time, religious de-affiliation. So I'll give you a moment, maybe 30, 60 seconds each in silence, Aaron and Brian, to give us a little blessing of sorts for this time. any form that feels comfortable to you in any language. And we'll just sit together for a moment, and when you're ready, whoever is ready can begin. And I thank you both for your wisdom and sharing this time and your spiritual traditions with us. And then after your blessings, my colleague Gail Allen, the coordinator for interfaith relations at the United Church of Canada, will close us out.
Yehira son milfanecha. May it be your will that we are able to experience moments of rest and pausing that fill us up, that bring appreciation to this world that leaves us feeling connected and obligated to engage in the work of repair, and that we're able to connect and work together to merit the kiss. I feel like that was a beautiful image that Brian shared that I hadn't heard before. The kiss in communion and of Shabbat. Amen.
Well, so I come from the Anglican tradition, and we're quite comfortable with printed order of service, printed prayers. So I'm quite comfortable to read something out. Extemporaneous prayer doesn't come easily to me. So what I want to share with you is something a little bit different, is find some time later today to dwell in quiet. And I find that personally quite challenging because I know my mind is really quite a monkey. It just wanders off. But I find it very helpful just to take a bit of quiet time and to bring my mind back to the people who are important to me in my life and start working out from that circle and see where that takes you.
Are we ready, Joshua?
Yeah, I think there was some Shabbat happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I it's hard to add words in after that. I almost hesitate, but I do have some words. First, words of gratitude and thanks to everyone who joined us to participate in this webinar this evening. And in particular, thanks to Kara and Joshua, who followed an idea sparked in their own conversation to create this deeper conversation we've had this evening. Thank you to also our tech team in the background, Samantha and Aaron G, for helping us to make sure this ran smoothly. And thank you to Aaron and Brian for gifting us with your insight, your wisdom, your scholarship, and your experience. You've encouraged us to reflect on the gifts, the possibilities, the challenges that Sabbath brings to both our faiths and from both our faiths and to society as a whole, and especially in this time of crisis we're in. You've reminded us of the values of Sabbath, of creation, liberation, rest, being rather than doing, reconciliation, community. But you've also reminded us that Sabbath includes responsibility and care that we really need to hear, particularly in this time of stress and vulnerability and inequities that are shown forth in COVID-19. So even as some of us find ways of seeing, slowing, settling, and new ways of being connected in this time, we do all have the responsibility to find ways of addressing some of these issues that are coming forth. And so I'd like to finally close with some words from a reflection on Sabbath that comes from a book called Practicing Our Faith. And Dorothy Bass in this book offers a vision of Sabbath, what we might hope from Sabbath, that I think sums up a lot of what we've heard this evening. She talks about Americans. I'm going to add North in as I read it because I think it applies for us too. She says, unwrapping this gift of Sabbath, also requires supporting underworked North Americans as they wonder what Sabbath keeping might mean for them. One of the cruelest features of the North American economy, which asks too much of many people, is that it casts numerous others aside, leaving them without sufficient work. A Sabbath-keeping community would be a community in which this injustice would not occur. When Sabbath comes, commerce halts, feasts are served, and all God's children play. Something Aaron reminded us of. Sabbath keeping bears a longing that all human beings will have good work, as well as a longing that no one will be required to toil without respite. And so I hope that all that we've heard and learned together this evening, we can take with us and continue responding to this COVID-19 crisis in ways that might answer this longing that is indeed a longing for liberation and justice. Thank you all.